This episode brought to you by How to Write Manga, your complete guide to the secrets of Japanese comic book storytelling. Available wherever fine ebooks are sold.
The world has gone insane. Cosplayers rule the conventions. Gamers dominate the tabletop and the internet. Sci-fi subjugates the movies, and fantasy rules the bookstore with an iron fist. Only one group can bring order to this unruly mob. A team of uber geeks, masters of the nerdly arts, trained for decades in the hobby shops and basements of the nation. Mobilized by the secret masters, they are the Department of Nerdly Affairs.
Hello, operatives, and welcome to the Department of Nerdly Affairs. I'm your host, Rob Patterson, here with my co-host, Don Chisholm.
Yep.
To talk about writing. And in general, kind of being an artist. Or to be more precise, how not to be a writer. Today we're going to talk about the reasons you shouldn't be a writer. I know this sounds odd, but you're going to find that the internet is filled with podcasts and websites and other places that are all telling you why you should be a writer. Because actually right now, some people say, is the best time to be a writer, perhaps in the history of mankind. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And there's lots of places that will tell you, yeah, you should just follow your writerly dreams right now. You can make $1 billion doing it. But the truth is, you probably shouldn't. And we're going to tell you why. We're going to tell you that if you want to be a writer, there are some challenges you are going to have to overcome. Now, that said, before we do that, I'm going to tell you the rules of being a writer, at least according to Robert A. Heinlein, the famous science fiction writer. He said, and I quote, "To be a writer, you must write and you must finish what you write." If you follow those rules, if you write and you actually finish what you're writing, congratulations, you are a writer. But if you want to be a paid writer, or someone who does this as a living or a profession, or to make a decent amount of extra money, maybe for your retirement or something, you're going to have to put a little more effort into it. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. The effort and the things that it's going to require of you if you want to actually be a professional or a money-making writer, or hopefully a money-making writer. Mm-hmm. All right, let's go right into it. So the first thing, since I talked about effort that's going to be required, is time. Mm-hmm. So Don, why is it going to require time if you want to be a good writer?
Well, because I think what Heinlein's really getting at, which is important, is you, even if you don't necessarily want to be a professional writer, you just want to be a decent writer, you have to do it because you don't get better at things by just sitting around thinking about them. Mm-hmm. And for any kind of creative endeavor, it takes a lot of time to produce. And it takes a lot of time to develop skills, and it takes that's probably the...
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. That's probably your biggest hurdle.
Yeah, it probably is. I mean, writing is a skill. People think, oh, you just sit down and you put words next to each other. In fact, you'll even see writerly advice all over the place. It's like, I think even Neil Gaiman did that in his 10 rules of writing, or 8 rules, or whatever it was. He basically said, yeah, just put one word next to the other and keep doing that until you make sentences and paragraphs and pages, and eventually you've written a story or a book or whatever. Mm-hmm. That's technically true. However, doing it well, like any other skill, requires immense amounts of time.
Yeah.
There are very few skills that don't require, unless you're a natural genius of some kind, a lot of practice. I think the general rule of thumb, I've heard 10,000 hours is the cliche, to actually master a skill, 10,000 hours.
Yeah.
For writers, the general writerly advice is your first 1,000,000 words. They generally say, try to get through your first 1,000,000 words as fast as possible because they're going to suck. And then in theory, if you've actually managed to get through 1,000,000 words, which is not as difficult as it quite sounds, you will be a decent writer. Or at least a competent writer. Yeah. That's the theory anyway, although there are many pulp writers who kind of dispute that. But Sorry?
I was going to say, if in that case, if you're Stephen King, you did that before breakfast today, so you're good to go.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Well, Stephen King having read On Writing, his autobiographical book about writing, which I also recommend everyone who wants to be a writer actually read. It's an amazing book. And I say that as someone who's not even a King fan. Says that you should write, I believe he says, 2,000 words every morning, which is quite doable. Most people can write, if they're got a decent typing speed, they can write about 1,000 words an hour. So that's really about 2 hours work, which doesn't sound that difficult.
No.
That's if you're kind of in the mode and you're writing well. And you maybe if you have things planned, you can do that 1,000 an hour. If you're not doing so well, maybe you'll get like 10 words an hour done. It depends on how well you're writing that day.
Yeah, there's that. The other thing with something like that too, with the idea of, if you want to say be a writer, just write, is even if you just sit down in the morning and you type up, it's a fragment of a story and it totally blows, you never know where that's ultimately going to take you.
True.
Like, I'm kind of more of a visual guy than, say, like a literary guy. And you'll do that if you're farting around, like, practicing drawing something, and it could just be something stupid. You never know what's going to click.
Yep, that's true.
Like, once upon a time, I spent weeks drawing tires.
Right.
Just tires, not tires on anything, just tires.
Right.
And when you're doing something like that, not necessarily directed, you're developing a skill because your brain starts to model things. It starts to think through things a little differently. And you never know where that'll take you.
True.
Because you might, I know when I did the tires, I did black and white and color, and it was where coloring tires all the time is where you learn about gray.
Right. Yeah, you would. And a lot of gray in tires.
Yeah, and then you think about the road, and tires don't blend into the road, but they're the same, but there's a different chromatic, there it is.
Chromatic, yes.
There's a different chromatic register for different things, and there's warm grays and cold grays and blah, blah, blah. And it's this little extra sniglet that you can add to your repertoire from just the equivalent of doodling.
Right. And writers do that too. As you said, writers write fragments sometimes. You never know when those fragments are going to end up becoming part of something or inspire something later on. I've got files and file folders on my computer filled with story fragments and pieces of stories and character notes and story notes. And some of them I come back to years later, sometimes even a decade or so later. I'll think, what was I thinking about? And then I'll go back through my fragments and I'll discover, it's kind of like a buried treasure that I put there myself.
Yeah.
I feel like a squirrel sometimes. You know how squirrels actually prepare all those nuts everywhere in the fall for the winter, and then half the time they forget where most of them were, and they'll come across them later as kind of like buried treasures. Like, oh my god, who put this here? Oh wait, I did. That's kind of what it's like being a writer sometimes, at least for me anyway. So yes, I mean, ultimately all that work does pay off, but there is a lot of work.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't just sit down and think, I can write better than him and do it. Some people can. There are occasional people who do. That's true. But there are also occasional people who win the lottery. Think about your odds on that.
Yeah.
And while you're doing all that time, let's talk about the next hurdle that you're going to hit being a writer, and that's family. Family, friends, social life, all those things that involve not being at your computer and not actually writing. But the thing is, you need to spend tons of time on your writing or art, as the case may be. So sometimes you have to choose. It's not easy to balance those things.
Yeah.
And your significant other is not always going to be that happy or appreciative of the time you're spending on writing.
Yeah.
Your dogs are not going to be that appreciative of the time you spend on writing.
Hey, that's why
they're going to want to play or go out or do whatever, and you're going to be like, no, I need to finish this. But nope. Family duty is going to call, and it's going to call during the worst possible times. Yeah. Not that I'm speaking from personal experience, but, that I have heard.
Yeah. Oh, no, not at all. Yeah.
Not at all, exactly. I mean, and plus you love your family, hopefully, and you want to spend time with them. But again, you also have to spend time writing, which is a solitary thing.
Yeah.
Also, back to the family thing, and we'll get more into this later, but there's also the whole thing of, well, if you have a steady job, that's okay. But if you don't have a steady job, you might be better off finding a steady job instead of spending your time writing.
Mm.
Or it may make things difficult finding a partner, actually, if you're, spending your time writing.
Yeah.
Many writers are introverts, so it's hard for them to get out and be social to begin with. But finding a partner for writers is not always an easy thing.
Yeah.
Or artists for any kind, really. But it can be a pretty lonely life,
Yeah.
which many writers channel back into their writing. But that's the way it goes, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Because that can be that tends to be reciprocal, I think.
Mm-hmm.
That a lot of people who really get into any kind of creative endeavor,
Right.
a lot of that starts when they're young because of social isolation.
Right, that's true.
Either like you're the weird kid nobody wants to talk to, or you have a deeper interest in stuff other than like hanging out and going to the dance and blah, blah, blah.
Right. And that's fine when you're young, but there does come a certain point in your life when you want other people to be part of your life, but it's not always compatible with your artistic endeavors. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. And so that can isolate you. Like what was refuge when you were young can sometimes actually turn into a prison as you get older, depending. It depends on what stage of life you're at, and what you're doing and how things are set up.
Well, not just that too, but you also, if you're really making a push for any kind of creative endeavor, one of the things that I find happens with like friends, family, and associates is a lot of them probably don't value the kind of things you do.
Yeah, that's true.
And you'll get that. Like I know people who are artists, and they're not necessarily, it's not their career, but they do pretty good doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of their families still think they're wasting their time.
Yep.
And they'll let you know that in no uncertain terms.
Yep. Actually, as someone who's been involved with writer communities online and that, I will tell you, it's astounding the number of writers who are homemakers of one kind or another, because there are some men too, but for the most part, they're women staying at home, taking care of their kid or kids, and they need an outlet or they need something to do.
Yeah.
And so they start writing. They use that extra time for writing if they are of the creative bent. And the truth is, it's the fact that their husband is out paying the bills that lets them do that.
Yeah.
That's why there are so many homemakers who are out there, putting novels out, or just often churning them out actually on Kindle or whatever. It's because, they have someone supporting them and taking care of them financially, so they have the opportunity to do that.
Yeah.
Which is not always true for those who have to work to survive.
Yeah, and that's one of the other things if you do anything creative, even if it's not with intent of a profession, is you'll find a lot of people will say, like, if you tell them, oh, you should get a hobby, you should sculpt like busts of people or whatever, what they'll respond with is, I don't have time for that. And what they don't understand is you make time for that.
If it's something you really value, you do, yeah.
Yeah, like, and it's, you have to, and I think that's one of the reasons you'll get, like, a fair amount of derision or disrespect if you're pursuing a creative endeavor, again, not even just professionally, because people will, say stuff like, "Yeah, it must be nice to have all that time to waste doing that when I got to do 400 tons of laundry and take care of 1,000 kids every day and blah, blah, blah." Yeah, my response is usually, yeah, should have used a rubber.
Ooh,
okay. Condoms cost $1. Kids you pay for your entire life.
They pay you back.
No, they don't. No, don't kid yourself.
Well, we're not going to go there.
This is the cyberpunk era. It's not going to happen.
Okay, well, on a slightly different note, to your point about making the time, I remember once hearing about, there was a British mystery writer whose name escapes me. I think I might have mentioned him in one of our shows a while back, way back, who basically just got up every morning at like 5 a.m. and wrote for 2 hours, then got breakfast and went off to his day job.
Yeah.
And he churned out like Stephen King levels of novels, but that was just writing for 2 hours every morning.
Yeah.
And I wish I knew the name of this dude, but I heard about him on a podcast. I think it was Mary Robinette Quall on the Writing Excuses podcast mentioned him. But anyway, but I've always taken that as a bit of an inspiration. I mean, if you really want to write, yeah, you will find the time. I've heard of writers, for example, that work all day and even put the kids to bed and everything, and then squeeze in their like hour and a half from like 10 to midnight each night or something like that. Instead of watching TV, they go off and write.
Yep.
And there are artists who do the same thing. I mean, if it's really important to you, you will make the time. You'll find the time. But I can't tell you it's going to be easy. It's probably not going to be easy.
Yeah. There was actually a Cracked article months back that talked about the idea, they used the example of exercise. That I'm going to wake up every day and jog for 2 hours. What nobody ever thinks of, and this is what the article is about, and I thought it was a good point, is what this will cost you.
Right.
So if you're going to say spend that 2 hours jogging or writing or painting, that 2 hours that you spent sleeping or like watching TV or that, you got something out of that, and you're not going to be getting whatever that is if you're using that time for something else.
Yes, exactly.
And
everything has a cost. Everything has an opportunity cost.
Yeah, and if you're just sitting there watching TV, well, that's usually decompression time.
Exactly.
And you're not going to have that if you stop watching TV and start jogging.
Yep, exactly. Although many writers will say that they find writing therapeutic and even relaxing. And in fact, for some people, it's almost a form of meditation.
Yeah.
So, and same with drawing or playing a musical instrument. Many creative endeavors for many people, especially those who are drawn to it, are actually therapeutic in their own way.
Yeah.
I think there is definitely something therapeutic about writing horror stories about killing off, various people you do not like. I think that would actually be very therapeutic. I haven't done it myself, of course, but I think that there would be something therapeutic about that.
Oh, who was it? Milton Caniff, I think, when he did the Terry and the Pirates comic, way back in the day.
Wow, that's dating yourself, Don, but okay, sure.
No, this is before I was even born.
I know it was, yeah.
But I believe it was him that when he drew the bad guys in the comic, because he was still in school when he started it, he'd draw them to look like all the people he didn't like.
Right, yeah, makes sense.
So, like, the class bully would be like the Nazi that the hero shoots and kills at the end of the one story and stuff.
Right. I suspect that happens a lot, especially with comic artists, but general writers as well.
Yeah, nowadays, though, that gets you put on a list.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Well, yeah, unfortunately. Yeah. That's why you write under a pseudonym, dude. That's why you write under a pseudonym. So hopefully nobody's tracking it back to you. Right now, I can't imagine being a horror writer or like one of those like thriller writers and actually writing under your real name. Because, I mean, if you really wanted to get into the nasty stuff, I mean, people are just, you're going to get put on a list somewhere. There's absolutely no question on that.
Yeah.
I guess, and that's what, that's actually another good point. Like, looking into the disadvantages of being a writer, or the challenges of being a writer, is that, you do have to consider that. I mean, some things, you're going to just be pulling them out of your imagination or even maybe your actual dark side, but not something you'd actually act on. But people are going to read that and go, whoa, I didn't know you were like that. That's an actual consideration, especially these days.
Yeah.
Where people are constantly judging each other and people are constantly putting each other on lists and things like that.
Yeah.
Based on what they say online or do or whatever. I mean, in theory, if you have one character do creepy stuff in a book or something like that, that's not really an issue, and people will probably just say, okay, well, that's the bad guy, that's fine. If you have bad guys, creep on you, like young girls, every single book that you write, people are going to start to wonder after a while, though.
Well, they will, and again, it gets to a lot of points, because there's also the idea, if you're an artist of some kind, what do you owe society? What does society owe you?
That's true.
But they've had some cases come up recently that broached that idea. Like, at what point does it stop being fiction?
Right.
Because if you write something, because we talked about this in a couple episodes, if you write something that's kind of weird and creepy, somebody's going to lose their shit about it. And in like the internet age, they're going to like put it everywhere that you're this horrible, terrible, vile person.
Right, that's true.
Because I was watching something about that where they were interviewing somebody who was talking about, you know, what kind of a mind is it that would write detailed, say, like murder stories. Like, this is a person thinking of murder all the time and there's something wrong and maybe these people should be examined. And I thought, well, with all the CSI series that are on and the people required just to produce that many shows, odds are 1 out of every 20 people in North America has written a CSI episode, so we're all going to end up in prison. Yeah.
I was going to say, was Agatha Christie really actually like a serial killer that just put all her work in fiction?
Yeah.
Is Stephen King like the most horrific mass murderer of all time, or like just truly twisted individual? Or is he just someone who's just putting his dark side on the page rather than... Or not even his dark side. I mean, you know, some of his nightmares on the page. Doesn't mean just because it's in the book doesn't mean he actually likes that.
Yeah, and again, it's there's even more difficult cases out there.
Mm-hmm.
I can think of two. There was one a few years ago where a dude was arrested for child pornography because he was basically writing these like stories that were child pornography.
Right.
But the case, I believe he didn't go to jail because they said it wasn't real.
Right. That
the stories were fiction, like nobody was actually getting hurt. So they couldn't actually convict him.
That's perfectly logical.
Yeah, and then there was also the case of the cannibal cop. I don't know if you remember that.
Remind me.
It was this dude, he was a police officer, and he wrote fiction, and he was on these, like, websites where people would write fiction and discuss, like, kidnapping people and murdering them and eating them and that.
Okay.
And he went to court. There was more to it, again, because they said he was writing all of this stuff and talking on these websites. He was actually considering doing it. Mm-hmm. But what ended up making his case more difficult was, as I recall... he was actually using his position to check up on... He was writing about actual people. And he was using his position and authority to keep tabs on these actual people he was writing about murdering and eating.
Okay.
So again, that kind of crosses that line a little bit because it's technically still imaginary, but there does appear to be action. And even then, it's the idea of using real people.
Right, yeah, exactly.
Like, you gotta wonder, that kind of approaches that line. Like, if I'm writing about killing and eating somebody I made up, that's a little different than if I'm, like, writing about, like, killing and eating, say, Chad.
Yeah, exactly.
So that gets that little creepier, but it's at that line where if I haven't actually, like, stockpiled rope and pepper spray to knock Chad out and season him just right... For when I finally cannibalize him.
I'm sure Chad's feeling really comfortable right now listening to this.
Maybe. But I don't know why. That's just the first example that popped into my mind.
Right. Okay. Chad, lock your door.
I'm not a freak. But anyway.
But that goes back to our point. Like, I mean, you bring this stuff up, and so... I guess this goes back to, again, my original point, which is, sometimes writing under an assumed pen name is not a bad idea.
Yeah.
There are disadvantages to it, but there are advantages to it too. And that's one of them, which is that you can sometimes be a little freer to write what you want, because if you use your real name and your family reads this, and actually, it doesn't even have to be that extreme. Yeah. I mean... Let's say you want to be a writer and you're writing some romance novels or something, or even westerns or something like that, and you know that your parents are going to read this at some point, that they're really happy that little Billy is actually, or little Susie has written a book or whatever. There's a thing that goes on in your head where it's like, well, wait, if my mom's going to read this, maybe I better tone it down, that kind of thing, unless your mom's into like hardcore action and pornography, which is okay, that's fine too. But the thing is that you naturally kind of hold back, and that's not a good thing. I mean, as a writer, you generally should be like giving it your all. Yeah. And depending on the audience and depending on what you're trying to do, but having limitations like that because people that are going to read this, it does affect your work. And so that's something to think about as well.
I'd also say it goes the other way too, because it's the idea of if you're going to write something truly horrifying and disgusting,
Mm-hmm.
I think you have to give consideration to how that's going to come across and whether or not that's going to be suitable for your work.
Right.
And I don't mean that in a don't do it kind of way, because you have to remember, like, I grew up on the underground comics,
Mm-hmm.
which were known for their like blatantness and disturbingness, and I'm a huge Go Nagai fan, and he's the dude that added gratuitous sex and violence to Japanese comics.
Yes, he did.
So I'm not saying don't, but I'm saying it's something you have to consider if you're going to start, crossing these lines and that. Because one of the things that always drives me nuts is when you get some kind of artist who produces a controversial work and then gets all freaked out because it's controversial.
Right.
And then you start thinking either this person's full of shit and just loves the attention, or, oh my God, you're the dumbest person on earth.
Yeah.
I don't know why people get offended at my statue of Abraham Lincoln blowing Jesus. That doesn't make sense. Like, it's just art. Oh, shut up.
Yeah, you're exactly right. They either are faking it or they are completely clueless, one way or the other.
Which and both can happen. Like, I've heard stories of different, like, say, cartoonists that have produced works that they didn't think was going to offend as many people as it did.
Mm-hmm. Well, someone once said, I think good art should offend the viewer or reader, as the case may be, or should make them feel or make them whatever.
Yeah.
And so I guess probably it's good art should provoke a reaction. That's probably what it is. So sometimes you don't always get the reaction you were expecting.
No, you don't.
That's just kind of the way it goes, which actually leads into the audience. Yeah. So when you're doing something, you definitely have to take your audience into account and how your audience is going to react.
Yeah.
And as we've said, your audience does not always react the way you expected them to. But a flip side of that is that you have to know who your audience is when you're writing.
Or get lucky.
Or get really lucky.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, you could do the Stephanie Meyer thing. She's the one who wrote Twilight. And just get completely lucky that you happen to have twinged on to the exact perfect frequency or whatever for your audience.
Yeah.
But in most cases, you do have to take your audience into account because you have to know, what do they know? What do they expect? What do they like? What don't they like? How do you reach them best?
Yeah.
I mean, and those are actual skills, as in people skills. You have to actually understand other human beings.
Yeah. Which is that part can be kind of difficult considering what we were saying before, how a lot of creative people kind of start in isolation.
Exactly. A lot of writers become writers because they don't want to deal with other people. But if you don't know how to deal with other people on some level or how other people work, you're not going to be a very good writer.
Yeah, I'd say essentially, but tying into the luck out kind of thing, you can sort of fall into a crowd. And I think this is, again, like we've talked about before, like the Stephanie Meyer thing, is you get, say, like, I don't want to say, they're not like, say, B-list artists or minor artists, but you can get people like, say I grew up like goth emo and I was into like the emo scene and I listened to emo music and I dressed emo and I wrote emo poetry. Well, there's a chance that other emo people might enjoy my poetry.
That's true.
So I've got a connection to that audience, but I can't expect that, say, the normals out there are going to really get anything out of this.
That's true.
However, there's always the thing that I might say I want to expand either my audience or my repertoire, and I can start taking, say, those emo sensibilities, and with a little luck, little skill, little perseverance, put it in a form that's more that a general audience would respond to, because it would be in those ideas, but put in terms that they're going to understand.
Yes. Yeah. Take something that's part of a subculture that you're intimately familiar with and find ways to translate it to the larger culture in general.
Yeah, and then everybody accuses you of selling out. But
which doesn't matter if you're actually making a living at it. If you're actually doing pretty well at it, screw them.
Yeah, and it's that too. I think also you got to be careful about the selling out kind of idea, because sometimes what looks like that is an artist looking to expand like their abilities, or looking to bring their ideas to a bigger audience. It's not just crass commercialism.
Right. That's true. I mean, sometimes you're just expanding in different ways as an artist. Yeah, I agree with you. And it's not about the money. The money just happens to be a side benefit, being able to eat and pay the bills, that whole thing.
Yeah.
Which is something that many artists struggle with.
Yep.
And especially writers, especially these days, okay, so why don't we actually get to that? So another disadvantage of being a writer these days, I kind of touched on it earlier, is that it's really hard to make money.
Yeah.
There was a ebook that's referred to as the Kindle Gold Rush days, which was right after the Kindle came out, and for a couple years after, like when the whole ebook thing started, you could publish a book because there wasn't that much competition and make a ton of money. And there were a few tricks to this. For a while, you had to actually offer free samples or things like that. But eventually, you could probably actually make some decent money. In fact, this is where most of the big names in Kindle and the so-called Kindle millionaires and that came from.
Right.
Most of them came from this period. They were people who published decent work during that time, and there was a fair amount of crap, and they published decent stuff. But because there wasn't as much competition, they actually did really well. Now, the market is absolutely flooded with everything humanly imaginable. And if you want dinosaur porn, you've got dinosaur porn.
And you know what?
If you want stories about romantic space dwarves, you've got stories about romantic space dwarves. If you want whatever, it's out there. And the problem is, it's literally clogging the system at this point. The truth is, everybody, their brother, their sister, their cousin, and their uncle is right now writing ebooks. They were told it would actually be an easy way to make money.
Yeah.
And the system was not designed to be good at helping you find those books. It really only helps you find the top ones in each category.
Yeah.
And so unless you're becoming a master of marketing and business and getting the word out there, the odds are very few people are actually ever going to see your work.
Yeah, well,
at least if you go independent anyway.
Yeah, it's a mixed blessing there too, though. I gotta say, the first thing that makes me laugh is you mentioned the dinosaur porn thing. I was reading an article fairly recently where they talked about some of the strangest things that you see in the self-published book market.
Was it on Cracked? That's where I remember reading about the dinosaur porn. They had an article about that. Yeah,
it was Cracked, and there was another one that had worked its way on. And I remember that because I remember thinking, well, how is that possible? Because dinosaurs are reptiles, and and I realized I'm thinking way too much about dinosaur porn and tried to block that out of my head. But anyway,
good idea.
Thank you, internet. But again, it's I think if you're gonna look at nowadays self-publishing your works, the thing is, the way the market works is it's more open for more people to actually make money producing their own work, but it's a lot less likely that you're ever going to make enough money that this will be your living.
Exactly. And I gotta tell you, even the big actual publishing companies, which do still exist, despite what the self-publishing acolytes will tell you, self-publishing is somewhere around 40% of the book market right now.
Yeah.
And it's stalled out basically at this point for various reasons.
Yeah.
But the truth is, 60% is still traditional publishing.
Yeah.
Even though traditional bookstores are not very healthy right now in a lot of places, some places they are. The truth is, those traditional publishers like Simon & Schuster, I think it's the big four or big 4.5, where I think we're down to 4 big publishers, are actually still making a ton of money and producing a ton of books. And there's also the mid-level publishers as well.
Yeah.
And most people are still relying on them to get the quality stuff.
Yeah. Or even I think what you'll start finding with the internet thing is you end up with the equivalent, because there'll be, say, websites that catalog and store, and you can download say, self-published novels, there'll start to be more and more of those that become bigger.
Mm-hmm.
So when you talk about, say, downloading ebooks, most people will say, well, I got this thing on my Kindle. Well, that's the Amazon one, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
And then those people are more likely to peruse Amazon
Yep.
to find it, even though, like, there's all kinds of self-published websites where somebody will put their own work up, but you're not as
Tons.
yeah, and they'll slowly get kind of squeezed out because you'll get like the Amazons and that right now it's easy and it's cheap because you can just, computer memory is cheap. You can store tons of whatever you want.
Oh yeah, it's basically costing Amazon almost nothing to have those books up and to distribute them.
Yeah.
So it's basically just pretty much pure profit for them.
Mm-hmm.
That's why Amazon actually pays like 70% to the writer. They only take 30% of the price for ebooks.
That's pretty good.
Well, that's because it literally is, that 30% is almost free money. So they're like, okay. Plus the idea is that it keeps them from going over to the competitors.
Yeah.
There were competitors at one time. There are still kind of sort of competitors, but the truth is Amazon rules the roost.
Yeah.
It's pretty much just Amazon, and then there's like the Apple iBook store, and there's Barnes and Noble may still have one, and yeah, that's pretty much it at this point. Kobo's still around. They're based out of Toronto. And so at least as far as the big, ebook, e-reader markets go, that's pretty much it. But it's like almost all Amazon. It's like, I think 80% or 90% Amazon. The other ones are fighting for the small pie that's left over.
Yeah.
So if you want to actually publish or self-publish, you really are going to go to Amazon. I mean, Amazon's the only one in the room. And that has its own disadvantage because it's just a matter of time before Amazon decides, 70% is a little much. We want 40% or 50% or more, because Amazon is just a shade away from being a monopoly as it is.
Yeah.
And so they're eventually going to pull the rug out from under writers. They've actually already done that a couple times. Not changing the price, but what they've done is things like they created the Kindle Reader program, where suddenly all your books were available for people who have Amazon Prime, which is this service down in the States. They could sign up for... what's it called? I'm suddenly blanking on it, but it's basically like Netflix for books. You basically pay one price per month. It comes with Prime for free, I think. And you basically can read all the books you want for free. And the writer gets paid by the page, and the rate is really, really crappy.
Just like the old days.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So anyway, this all comes down to this. Being a writer, especially a self-published writer, is incredibly hard work because you have to do all the business side and all the marketing yourself. There's an astounding amount of competition unless you have a really good niche or you're incredibly good again. It's kind of a meritocracy that way. I mean, the really best do actually tend to rise to the top, but the truth is most people are not the best. And if you're a struggling newbie coming in, you're not going to be the best either.
Yeah, and I don't know if I'd necessarily say best. Because it's a lot of times too, it's not necessarily a measure of quality.
That's true.
There's a lot of finding a niche that nobody else knew was there, and then being the first one in. So like if you like, I hate coming back to this, but the very first person who wrote Dinosaur Porn probably made a ton of money doing that.
Probably, yeah.
Because I'm betting that's a niche that nobody knew was there, and it was a kink that a lot of people didn't realize they had.
I totally believe that, yeah. And then a lot of people read it just because they heard Dinosaur Porn, and so they read it just to see what it was. It's like, I'll spend $1 on that just to find out. Not that I did, but people will say that. I mean, because... Yeah, I mean, there's all these different kinks, and I know that that's kind of what happened with the whole erotica scene for a while there, was that once Dinosaur Porn took off, everyone began writing every sort of, fetish and kink porn they could come up with, because they were all hoping to get some of that sweet dinosaur porn money. You understand what I mean, the sweet fetish porn money.
Yeah.
And it reached the point where actually on Kindle, porn is basically ghettoized. It's there, but you have to go digging really deep to get into the porn areas because they didn't want their system to be known for some place to get porn.
Yeah.
So if you have actual porn, it actually has to be buried somewhere deep within the Amazon system. Now, people who really want it can get it and find it, but it's not easy.
Well, and
It's kind of buried at the back in that little room at the back of the store.
the dark part where nobody goes.
Exactly, except for that guy in the overcoat.
But that's the other problem too, that I think when we're entering, I guess, the post-internet world, the idea that you've got a lot of you had a lot of this creativity and inventiveness and creepiness, and everybody did everything, but you're starting to see the return of the gatekeepers, because you're starting to see the websites that won for distribution.
Yep.
And then you'll see a narrowing again, because it'll be like, say, Amazon decides that their stuff, for whatever reason, they just don't want to deal with, and then it's all gone.
Yep. Well, the erotica sites responded by creating new erotica ebook sites that are specifically for that stuff. But again, they're not on Amazon.
Yeah, and you're getting less distribution, and it becomes also one of the other problems with making a living self-publishing stuff is the mediums themselves start breaking into ever specific subgenres. Because again, like we said, it doesn't really cost any money or that to put up anything you want. And as they splinter into the smaller subgenres, what ends up happening is your audience gets smaller and they get more loyal, but there's less of them.
There's less of them, yeah.
Yeah, so you'll get people who like, well, I don't like general dinosaur porn, but if there's a Pachycephalosaurus in it, I am so there.
Right.
And then you're like, well, how many people are writing Pachycephalosaurus porn? Well, there'll be a couple. And then you're like, how many people are that interested in specifically Pachycephalosaurus porn? And there'll be some. So you've got this ready-made market who is probably going to be frighteningly loyal.
Yeah.
And they're not going to be enough for you to make a living doing it.
Right. Well, there's a saying among the self-publishing circles that what you need is like 1,000 true fans. And that's what you need really to survive in the self-publishing market.
Yeah.
And with the logic being this, so let's say I was capable of putting out a book a month, okay? And I sell that book for $4. Amazon takes their cut. I get $3 a pop. Well, if I've got 1,000 true fans who all buy that book just made me $3,000.
Yeah.
Which is not great money, but if I can do that once a month, that's okay.
Yeah.
Assuming if I'm good enough to get 1,000 true fans, I've probably got lots of casuals on top of that and other things as well.
Right.
It is a numbers game. You really have to play that numbers game. And getting the 1,000 true fans sounds easy, but it's pretty tough. And I'll keep in mind what I just said. You would have to be able to do that once a month, or maybe once every 2 weeks, or charge more, or all these other things you have to take into account from a business side. Something that many writers do not want to deal with. Yeah. I mean, once upon a time, you wrote a book, you got an agent, and you let them them and the publisher take care of everything.
Yeah.
Now, if you do that, you're probably just going to get screwed over.
Yeah.
Because the publishers at this point, let's do the other half actually then. Okay, so let's say you poo-poo small press or indie publishing, perfectly reasonable. You want to go for the big boys. As I just said, they're 60% of the market, perfectly reasonable. Here's the problem. You would go with the big boys because you want to be taken care of properly, like Stephen King is or whatever.
Yeah.
Except that's not going to happen, because thanks to the fact that their sales overall are declining, the big boys have limited marketing budgets, and they have a very simple formula: the hot new people get the marketing money, the old hands who they know are good sales get the marketing money, the other 80 to 90% of writers who get published by them don't get the marketing money.
Yeah.
In other words, they literally will publish your book and then turn around and say, you have to do the marketing for your own book.
Yeah.
Congratulations. You get, if you're lucky, 15% of the book price, and you still have to do all the marketing that the self-publishers did.
Yeah.
But you got in a real bookstore. Congratulations, dude.
Yeah. Well, there's the other part of the spectrum to that, which is, the winning the lottery in the publishing game, is the idea of your work being picked up for transition to another medium.
Yes, that's true.
So, like, say, them making a movie of your book.
there are self-published books that have been optioned for movies and that too. That happens. Actually, here, you heard about The Martian.
Uh-huh.
The movie with Matt Damon that came out last year, about a year ago, that everyone went crazy for. That was a self-published book.
Mm-hmm.
It exploded. It got self-published. It exploded. Everyone loved it. It got picked up by a real publisher too, but that was after it had already done well as a self-published book.
Yeah.
And and it got optioned for Hollywood, and everyone went nuts for it. For Matt Damon's character growing potatoes on Mars. I read some of the book. I got a little bored pretty quick actually, and I'm okay with science, but oh my god, it's literally a guy doing like calorie equations to try to figure out how long he can survive on Mars. There's the phrase "science the shit out of things." You have no idea what that means until you try reading The Martian. Science the shit. Oh my god, it's like it's literally a survival science lesson in book form. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's fairly well written. It's just like, oh my god, there's a lot of detail here.
Right.
Anyway, hard sci-fi with heavy on the hard. Okay, so I got off track, but the key point is, no, there are success stories from the self-publishing world. But, as you say, if you're officially published, you've gotten past some gatekeepers, and you're a little more likely to get picked up by Hollywood or whatever, or get noticed. That definitely does seem to be true. Well, because if you're in the bookstores, right, you're more likely to get noticed. Yeah. That's just the way it is. I mean, even Hollywood people do occasionally read books or wander into bookstores, even if it's just to buy coffee. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sorry, Hollywood people. Anyway, there goes our Hollywood listener. Hey, come back. Oh, well. I liked her. Oh, well. Anyway, whatever. All right, so the joking aside, yeah, you're right. I mean, translating to other mediums, it does help if you go with one of the big boys, but self-published can go that way too, and small press. Yeah. It's mostly about just putting something that for whatever reason clicks, right? Yeah. That it's literally still like winning the lottery. You have to write something that clicks with a greater audience. Yeah. And that can literally turn into your meal ticket, which is not going to happen for the majority of writers and not going to happen for the majority of books. That's just the way it is. Yeah. It's your odds of winning the lottery are only slightly worse. Yeah. Depending on how many books you write. I mean, it's like every lottery ticket you buy, there's a better chance, but...
Well, and not just that, but it's the idea that, let's say I self-publish books, and I've got 10 regular followers. If you put enough material out, you can still make a fair amount of cash.
Yeah, that's true.
Like if I got 10 loyal followers and I can and they'll spend $1 for one of my books and I can put 3 books out a week. Like that's like $30 a week kind of thing. Right. Plus there's the idea that
did you just say 3 books a week?
Yeah.
Okay, I assume we're talking short stories here. We're not talking actual novels or books or anything, but okay, go ahead.
Oh no, this is like what I do. I don't sleep anymore.
Okay.
So I'm I'm one of those pulp era guys.
Okay. Well, I'm glad to hear you're being productive. Wait. Are you the guy writing Dinosaur Porn? That's you, right?
No.
We'll talk after. Okay. I want to know your secrets, man. All right. So anyway,
but you can do that, and then there's also the idea that when we were talking with Jeff the first time, he mentioned passive income.
Passive income is the way you go. If you can get it, it's awesome.
Yeah, and if I've got say I've written 1,000 books, and every month 1 or 2 people just sort of out of curiosity wanders through my archive wherever it happens to be, and will buy one of them. If I've got enough of them up there, I can make a couple of bucks.
Yeah, you can actually. That's true. If every one of your stories sells 10 copies a month and you have 1,000 stories, how much money is that? Yeah, I know. It goes back to what I said earlier. It's a numbers game. It really is. I mean, you can win by quality and you can win by quantity. Yep. But neither of them is easy.
No. And there's luck involved with both, really.
With both, yeah. There's luck involved with both. Although if you do quantity, I mean, eventually you're getting some skill, too. You're going to produce some stuff that's actually going to win. I've generally heard that with self-publishing, the 80-20 rule applies, which is that 20% of your work will be 80% of your profit. Okay. But the trick is that means you have to write at least 10 books before you're going to actually see a return. Yeah. Depending, again, you never know which one's going to be one of the ones that's going to profit you.
Yeah, and that goes kind of with the old adage for if you're producing creative work, if you've been around for 10 years, now you're a fixture.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's true too.
Mm.
I was talking a few months ago with the Scottish science fiction writer Gary Gibson, and he mentioned to me that his first book, and he's written, I think, it's like 6 or 7 books at this point, but his first book, Stealing Light, that he wrote, is actually still the one that makes most of his money.
Yeah.
Like, he's written a whole bunch since, but it's still that first book. That's what people buy.
Mm-hmm.
Even though he's written several series and everything, nope, they still keep buying that book.
Yeah. With the audience, you kind of never know what's going to hit.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
Like, you can calculate it and plan it and increase your odds, but ultimately it's a crapshoot.
Mm-hmm. That's true. Yeah, you never know what's going to actually work.
Yeah.
So, you better produce the best work you possibly can.
Yeah, and prepare for surprises.
Yes. Yeah, prepare for lots of surprises.
I had one. I put a couple of old comics up on one website where you'd put them like page by page.
Right.
And I thought it was interesting because most of the pages got, say, like 100 views, somewhere around there. But there was one page that got like 3,000 views, and it was people standing around.
Right.
Like, nothing happens. It wasn't an exciting... It was just people standing around. I'm like, really? This is what everybody loved?
Yep. I have similar things with both the blog, my personal blog at robinpatterson.com, and my old podcast, Kung Fu Action Theater. Mm-hmm. There are certain episodes. We did like almost 50 episodes of audio drama, most of which are grouped into series, most of which are grouped into series of one kind or another. But there are certain episodes that when I look at the stats, just have massive numbers of downloads. And they're like in the middle of series. It's like episode 3 of this has like 20,000 downloads. And every other episode has like 6,000 downloads. It's like, why does episode 3 have so many downloads? Or why does this blog post get so many damn hits? It's like, I did this blog post about horses. It's like, why is this horse blog post getting so many hits? But it does. It just got linked to somewhere, or is high in the rankings somewhere of something. And so it ends up just getting constant hits.
Yeah.
And I don't know why. That's just the random nature of the internet, right? That's just the way it goes.
And then that would be the weird thing when you get that, like, say, one page that everybody loved, and you're like, well, how come you didn't look at any of the other stuff?
Exactly. Yeah.
That's so weird.
Exactly. Okay, you listened to episode 3. Why not 1, 2, or the other, other sets that came after, other 17 that came after it? Why did you listen to just this? I don't understand. But that happens.
3 was awesome, but 4 was just way too commercial, I heard.
Apparently it was. Apparently it was. Yep. So, yeah, that's the thing. Like, writing, like being any other kind of artist at this point, but definitely being a writer in this environment is a lottery ticket. It really is. I mean, you're not likely to win. The odds are not with you, but there is that possibility. But it's going to cost you. It's going to cost you in many different ways.
Right.
Now, one way to maximize being a success as a writer is, of course, to produce quality work. And that just doesn't just involve skill. I mean, you can spend 3 years of your life producing, let's say, 10 million words, okay, and be the most skillful writer ever in terms of skill, but still produce incredibly boring work. Or maybe your work is also incredibly derivative. Because the truth is, you need something that's going to make your work unique. And the thing that's going to make your work unique is you. That's the thing. It's going to make your take on the world and your perspectives and everything. That's what's going to make your work unique. If you are reading the same books, watching the same TV shows, playing the same video games, talking about the same stuff as everyone else, guess what? You're going to write the same stuff as everyone else. You need fuel that's not the norm, or at least it's going to be unique to you. And that's one of the reasons why life experience is perhaps one of the most important things a writer needs. They need life experience both in terms of creative input, and they also need life experience in terms of personal experience.
Yeah.
As someone once said, you can't write. What is it? Oh, what's your? what was the famous line that you always say, Don, about life experience?
Oh, why?
I did my PhD in life experience.
Yeah, from The Simpsons.
Yeah, I did my PhD in life experience. Yeah, you can't do that. It doesn't work. You do get life experience doing your PhD, trust me, but you get the same life experience that every other grad student gets, pretty much. So the thing is, the more you do and the more you see and the more you take in that's different from other people and his personal experience, that shows up on the page. It really does. But the thing is, you have to actually get out there and do. You have to explore. You have to go out into the world. And I don't just mean to collect Pokemon in Pokemon Go. I mean, you have to really go out into the world.
Yeah, because it's the sort of thing. I think the best example of how not to do this was if you look at say superhero comics in the 80s. The X-Men took off.
Right.
There were 100 billion X-Men ripoffs.
Right, because everyone read the X-Men. They all loved the X-Men, so they wanted to just do the X-Men.
Well, and there was that, and then when you got to the 90s and the next generation of comic book guys started doing superheroes, you could tell they were the last generation of fans because every superhero team was Cyclops, Wolverine, and the Chick.
Yeah, basically.
And like everyone was, and it was the same stuff over and over because nobody had anything to add to the mix.
I'll go a step further back, actually. Maybe the older listeners would understand what I mean by this. A lot of the reasons why television from the, I'd say the 60s to the 80s probably, but we'll include 50s TV in this as well, but generally we'll call it the golden and silver age TV. A lot of it is actually very well written. And part of that is because, and has a lot of impact. In fact, a lot of it has a lot more impact than modern stuff does. And this is partly because it was written by an entire generation that had gone off to fight in World War II. These people had literally lived and fought. And I'm not saying you have to go off and join the army. And then, of course, by my state logic, shouldn't they all be writing the same thing? And the answer is yes and no, because they had a variety of experiences. I mean, Gene Roddenberry wrote Star Trek based on his experience as a World War II bomber pilot, to get nerdy again. And so as an end result, it shows. Like, he really knew the military life, and it shows in the original series much better than it does in the later Star Trek series that came along. His experience shows in his writing and shows up on the screen. And people who lived, it shows in their work. It really does. I mean, there's the old writer's saying of write what you know. Well, you have to know something before you can write it well, don't you? And that's just not always... I mean, if you're a historical writer, okay, fine, secondhand knowledge is nice, but also, learning about, how people like crafted a sword, maybe by doing it or being involved with it or getting involved with historical martial arts or traveling to historical sites where you're writing about, that actually can add a lot. I mean, things you can't get from reading a book, for example, or even some diaries or accounts. You really need to actually live some of it or get some personal experience in there.
Well, and because again, too, that's how you learn the small, the personal, the human bits of it.
Exactly.
To take that kind of a little sideways, one of the things that I've noticed with most of the nerdly arts that never quite rings true is how sports are portrayed.
Really? Okay, go on.
Yeah, because if you look, one of the running things that you always see in like just about every like nerdly story is there's always the gladiatorial combat episode. And there's always like it's a fight to the death between our champion, blah 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 and blah. And if you had any kind of like advanced society, and this was something that you see in a lot of science fiction where they go to the planet where like they get arrested for something and then they're put in combat with like the champion and they have to blah blah. Well, if you have any kind of advanced society, you're not going to see that for the same reason that in real life pro athletes are babied, because they've put a lot of money into these people and they don't want to see them getting wrecked before they get their the entertainment cash out of the audience.
Exactly. Yeah, they're like pro wrestlers. I mean, they don't really let those guys get hurt.
Well, they try not
They're
to.
cash cows. Well, they try not to,
Yeah.
but they're cash cows. Yeah, I mean, you don't want to kill the golden goose.
Yeah, I mean, and that's something that never comes up.
Yeah, exactly. Also, you would think the most advanced societies would probably have found alternatives. Like sports, for example. Like, not gladiatorial sports, but good old-fashioned regular sports. The ones that take the combat aspect out of it for the most part, but are still kind of thrilling and interesting. Like we do in real things, like the Olympics.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see your point that they don't always do sport right. Which is odd when you think about how sports-obsessed North American society often is.
Oh, most societies.
Yeah, most societies, that's true. But North Americans, and this is my own personal observation, are not very good at doing sports drama. Like, they're really not. They're incredibly focused on it, but when it comes to actually producing drama about sports, about athletes, they kind of suck.
Yeah.
I mean, there have been a few exceptions, like there was a football series called Friday Night Lights that was pretty impressive. But for the most part, they really suck at it. Like, North Americans are just not very good at producing sports dramas. No. I mean, not in the same way that, and I'm sorry this is going to hurt some people's feelings, but the Japanese are really good at producing sports dramas. They really are. You sound like you're going to disagree. I can hear that butt coming, Don. I can hear that breath going in for that butt. Go.
Oh, I'm not going to disagree, but what I was going to say is there's a lot of places that are really good at that that aren't here. Because if you want to talk, say, comics, the Brits do a lot of sports dramas. At least historically they did.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, mostly about football, quote unquote.
Well, yes, yeah, their football. We know it's not real football, but whatever.
We're Canadian.
There goes our UK listeners. Bye, guys.
Oh, both of them? No.
Oh, damn it. All right.
But yeah, you're right that's something. Well, we kind of here in North America, we don't do straight up drama too well because we tend to fall into the soap opera pattern.
That's true.
And it becomes really cartoony in a hurry.
Yes. Yeah, our idea of drama is basically about men and women like having relationship issues.
Yeah,
and that's kind of it.
And having just the same ones over and over, and they get bigger, and there's always the scene where like the season ends with somebody shooting somebody else, and you're like, oh, okay, really?
Yeah, well, that's because real relationship issues have real consequences. Remember, the North American formula is based on the idea that these characters change as little as possible because you want to milk as much money out of them as you possibly can.
Yeah.
And as many entertainment dollars. As you just said about gladiatorial combat. Like, real drama is kind of like gladiatorial combat. It has real consequences.
Yeah.
And North American entertainment is designed around the idea of avoiding real consequences for as long as possible.
Yeah. Well,
maybe that's why they don't do it very well.
Yeah, there's that, and I think when you come to things like, say, sports, that you get a lot of, especially for like the nerdly arts, you get a lot of people that they may be fans, but they're not super into the nuts and bolts, and that makes it hard to draw stories out from it.
That's true. Yeah, I can see that.
And it's the same talking too, like what you were getting at. When you get to like the more nerdly kinds of stories, you never really see entertainment portrayed unless it's part of the plot.
They're trying to avoid it, I think. I mean, most people, when they're doing, say, science fiction, for example, yeah, the media, unless again it's part of the plot, as you said, is something to kind of be avoided because that's that extra level of creativity that you don't want to have to engage in. It's also a little bit risky because you never know how the audience is going to take it, so it's just easier to avoid it.
Yeah, I think plus too, there's the idea that a lot of people who end up, producing like more nerdly entertainment come from that tradition. And there tends to be I guess the word would be snobbery.
Well, definitely, yeah.
That you'll get people who are into sci-fi, especially, quote unquote hard sci-fi, that look at contempt on sitcoms.
Right.
But the thing is, if you're creating a society, you're more likely that everybody in that society would partake of something like a sitcom over like, reading Asimov.
That's true. Absolutely, yeah.
And you never really get that, and I think it's because for a lot of creators, it's not something they themselves have thought through.
Hmm.
And it's not something like it's far afield from their own experience. So
Right.
they have difficulty bringing that in any kind of genuine way unless they make it part of the plot.
Right.
So they'll
I'll give you an example. I mentioned way back in an early episode there was the Lost Fleet series of books that I read last year, or I read like what? There are 11 books to the Lost Fleet series, the primary one, which is about it's the Buck Rogers thing where the guy gets basically frozen in suspended animation for a century or so, and gets woken up and becomes like a great war hero in the new century. Okay. 11 novels, 11 thick novels about, this guy being exposed to this new culture and new society and like fighting a war among these people that he's learning to become part of and everything like that. Never once is there any mention of art or culture in all 11 books. Apparently, these people on these ships have no art, or actually, correction. There are vague indirect references to apparently they share pornography on their on their fleet-wide internet.
Okay.
They do actually make a reference to that there's apparently pornography is the only culture these people apparently have. So, yeah. I think there might also be one or two minor references actually to like dramas or something, but for the most part, like, yeah, I mean, you would think that it'd be like, okay, well, what stars are still, what's your culture like? Nope. Everything is just about, the war, the fighting, the cold military life and everything, which apparently is incredibly cold and sterile because we both know military people don't talk about anything like culture or anything like that. They only talk about guns and stuff, right, Don?
A lot of them do, but there's a lot of goofy shit that happens too.
Exactly. So yeah, it's one of those things that and that's normal for sci-fi. I think that's just part of the paradigm, though. I think North American Western sci-fi definitely works on the idea of the focus on the story, and anything extra, like culture, for example, or art, is generally relegated to the background if it's mentioned at all.
Yeah, and again, I think a lot of it comes down to tropes and that. Like you mentioned the military thing, and everybody is always like the 1950s square-jawed, serious guy. And since the 90s, you've had anytime you have like a Starfleet, they're all angry all the time and
right, yep,
blah blah blah. Whereas, if you've never been involved in the military, this isn't necessary. Like it's something. Those tropes are probably all you know.
Right.
And it's not a realistic picture, and it's not a fully fleshed out picture, and it's the kind of thing like the organization is made up of human beings, and human beings have all kinds of foibles and that nobody thinks of because that's not something anyone's ever really focused on before.
Exactly. So to go back to our original point then, having life experience with the military or connected to the military in some way helps a lot if you're writing about the military.
Yeah.
If you're writing about a military.
Yeah, even just to flavorize it. Like you mentioned Gene Roddenberry. And when you watch the original Star Trek, having had a little more experience with the military and watching it again, you see all kinds of little things in it that you didn't notice before that I think lend kind of an air of credibility to it on a subliminal level.
Right.
Like there's an episode where Kirk is getting stressed and McCoy is telling him that he needs to relax, and McCoy's doing it in his typical, restrained fashion. And he gets in his face, he's like, Jim, you've got to take a break. You're pushing yourself too hard. You're going to... And Kirk gets pissed off at him and, like, jacks him up. Like, proper military, you listen to me, mister, you're my subordinate in that. And if you watch, McCoy comes to attention.
Really? Okay, I never noticed that.
He stiffens up, and he starts referring to him as Captain.
I think I vaguely remember that. Yeah, okay.
For the rest of that scene, he doesn't call him Jim, he calls him Captain. And that's because even though they're friends, they're still military. That military discipline is drummed into you.
Yep, even the Doctor.
Yeah. And you can see those relationships in that regard, which is something, again, later series and a lot of like Star Trek ripoffs just don't have, because I'm thinking the people who were writing it in that didn't have the experience that, say, Roddenberry did.
Right. I can see that. I can totally see that.
Mm,
Um, it was written by a bunch of people that, well, whose life experience was working in Hollywood as writers for the most part.
Yeah.
Yeah, the later stuff. I'm sure there was probably some military vets probably writing for the later Star Trek shows, but not that many.
Yeah, and again, when you look when the original one came out, that was just like, what, 20 years after World War II?
Yep, yeah, it was. So most of the people who were writing for it, again, going back to my point, were people with actual military experience. Some people who had actually fought. Same with the westerns of the period are like that too.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I would like to think that even the writers on, say, something like MASH probably were people who had actually been in combat or actually knew a little bit of what that was like.
They might.
MASH, I'm not 100% sure on, but I'd bet some of them.
Well, I believe that MASH had something that we haven't seen for a while in TV, and that they had consultants.
Oh, well, there's that, yeah.
And that was something I don't know if they do anymore, but you used to see that for...
Oh, they do. There are consultants, yeah.
Okay.
You'll see them in the credits sometimes. You will see consultants still.
Because I wouldn't think they would, because again, if you watch something like CSI where two people share like a keyboard and the CSI guys are going all Judge Dredd and bringing in the crooks, like, you're like, I don't think there's a consultant on this show. That's not how it works.
Right. Yeah, well, that's true. Well, because CSI, I think one year the CSI actually won like a science fiction award or something like that. One of them did actually. They won an award for like best science fiction show on TV, I think, or something to that effect.
Uh-huh.
For good reason.
Yeah.
Good reason. Actually, and there's a flip side though, which is now, of course, sometimes you can't get the life experience.
Yeah.
But if you can't get the life experience, you should at least make the effort to do the research, which again requires time and effort.
Yeah.
I keep coming back to, there was a story I read in a writer's craft book like this, and this was like 25 years ago, that I always remember. And this was a bit of advice. There was a short story writer who, this was back in the days when there were actually magazines. And so he wrote a short story about what I think was like a tugboat captain.
Uh-huh.
And he wrote this short story and turned it into his editor, and his editor rejected it. His editor said, this is kind of dull, it's boring. You should, either rework it or do something else. And so what the dude did is, he actually thought, okay, well, I like this story, so let's see if I can beef it up a little bit. So he lived in a port city, so he went down and he actually found a tugboat captain, and he talked with him, and the captain's like, well, you want to come out? It's like, oh, okay, sure. And so he actually went out on the boat. Back in the days before the insurance company probably wouldn't let that happen anymore, but whatever. He actually went out and he spent the day with the tugboat captain. He went back, he rewrote the story with all the new details, and the editor bought it right away.
Mm-hmm.
Because he was offering him something that had real experience. It suddenly, the story came to life because he'd done the research.
Yeah.
Even if he couldn't be a tugboat captain, he'd at least gone out and spent some time with one and gotten the feel for the thing. Mm-hmm. And that made all the difference in making that story and selling that story.
Yeah, because you can add those little bits that make it seem more tangible to the audience.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't really do that if you don't have anything to compare it to.
Right, exactly.
So, and you can extrapolate it. Like if you're writing a story, like a horror story about, this like dark woods where this evil monster lives and it's all creepy and that.
Mm-hmm.
If you've ever, say, gone camping
mm-hmm.
and just walk, like 15 meters away from like your tent and just look, you get that little taste of what that isolation is like.
Yep, you do.
And you record that, and then you have that to extrapolate from.
Some of it, of course, also has to come down to personal interest.
Yeah.
Because you really should be writing things that you're interested in.
Mm-hmm.
And this is kind of a double-edged sword. Because, yes, you should be writing things you're interested in, but what you're interested in may not always be what sells.
Yeah.
I mean, you might be interested in 15th century Aboriginal tribal romance. Okay, that's fine. There may not be a huge market for that.
True.
So you might have to take this into account. I mean, can you keep up the motivation? Can you keep focused and keep writing about this stuff if you're not interested in it.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you know that you're not going to make money doing it.
Yeah.
That's why I say it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
You sometimes have to choose between what you're interested in and what's actually going to make money.
Well,
because trust me, the more general derivative stuff, that's what makes money.
Yeah. There's also the problem too if you're interested in something, it's difficult to step outside of it and get that big picture view.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, if you were, say, a hardcore Anne Rice fan, and you were, like, into emo, and then you wrote, like, your emo vampire stories, because you're so attached to that, you might have a difficulty critiquing your own work and saying, you know, this doesn't make sense, and this doesn't fit with that, and this, because you're just writing the stuff that gives you an emotional response.
That's true. Well, I guess it comes back down to how personal do you want to make it, right?
Yeah.
If you make stuff too personal, other people might not be able to relate to it anymore.
Yeah. Well, there's that, and there's also what I think a lot of creative people neglect is the theory side of what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And then that ties in with the idea of getting life experience, having a repertoire you can draw from,
mm-hmm.
And having given some thought to that. So it's not just that you go out on the ship with the salty sea captain. You remember those experiences, you put them in some kind of context,
right?
You wrap your head around it from a couple different angles, and then that lets you draw from that in different ways, depending on what it is you want to do with your story.
All right, so I think we can probably leave it there then. I think we've covered things pretty well. I think, actually, before we go, I want to just mention that there is such a thing, though, as the universally specific. Mm-hmm. Which is the idea we're all human beings, right?
Yeah.
So we all relate to each other as human beings. So even if a story is very specific to you, let's say your experiences as a mail carrier, for example, you might be writing about your specific experiences, but other people who have jobs do kind of relate to it on the level of having jobs, right? And,
mm-hmm.
Having to deal with the difficulties of dealing with customers and clients and things like that. So it's kind of a balance, really. It's finding a spot where you're not too personal, but you are still personal enough to add flavor and add something to the work.
Well, that's it's also the idea of understanding the nature of your own work.
That's true.
Like if I'm writing about a postal carrier, I should ask myself, am I writing about being a postal carrier? Am I writing about a character who is a postal carrier? Or am I strictly writing about an event that happens during this character's life as a postal carrier? Because each of those is going to come out totally different.
That's true. And they're going to produce different results with the audience as well. Mm-hmm. That's true.
Yeah.
Well, and that's part of knowing your craft, right?
Yep.
Which goes back to the whole idea of skill and time and effort that you have to put into it.
Mm-hmm.
Writing, like anything else, requires skill. It really does. And skill requires time and effort.
Yep.
And there's no other ways around it. It's no different than becoming an artist. I mean, if you want to actually be able to draw half decently, how much time and effort does it require, Don?
A bit.
Yeah, just a bit, right? Yeah, just a bit. As you said, it requires spending weeks drawing tires and things like that. And you get a lot from it. You do.
Yep.
But you have to put in that effort. You have to put in that time and effort. And those are the biggest things that you have to be willing to put in to be a writer or an artist. And you may have to do it without any real expectation of a solid reward at the end. That's the thing. The only reward you may get is actually a few people saying, oh, it's pretty good.
Yeah.
Or they might say, you really should have taken up being a mortician instead. Gone into the family business. That would have been a better idea.
Yeah, I think you've hit on what the fundamental difference between, say, like an artist and, I don't know, a hobbyist, maybe.
Right, yeah.
Is that idea, are you producing what you're producing for the sake of producing it? Or are you producing it in anticipation of some kind of reward or payment for doing so?
Yes, definitely. Yeah. Why are you doing it? And you need to understand why you're doing it. Like, that's part of personal motivation. Yeah. What's your motivation? To go back to the old actor's joke or line.
Mm-hmm.
Why are you doing it? And if you don't have a real reason why you're doing it, you may not get very far.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not to say that you always need to know. I mean, there are some artists who are just driven to do things and they have no choice in the matter. I mean,
Yeah.
someone once said that if you're a true artist, yeah, you'll do it anyway. I mean, no matter what people tell you, how many times people tell you not to do something, you'll still do it anyway if you're a true artist. Because you have no choice.
Actually, the phrase that comes to mind that I once heard somebody say was, asking whether or not you should do this is like a normal person asking whether or not they should breathe.
Exactly, yeah.
I don't know if you remember who said that.
I don't actually. Who said that?
You said that.
Oh, I did. Did I?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Like 2 years ago.
Wow, okay. There we go.
Rob is smart.
I can be sometimes. Rob is both smart and incredibly forgetful. Dude, my whole life has been a series of people coming to me and saying, you know, what you said was completely right. What you said was right on the money. And I'm like, what did I say?
No, you're supposed to go, yes, it is. I'm a genius.
Well, sometimes I do that. It's like, oh, yeah, okay, yeah, it was. And but I have no idea what they're talking about because I'm like one of the most absent-minded, forgetful human beings on the face of the planet. Someone could actually ask me the secrets of the universe one day, casually in passing, and I'll tell them the actual correct answer, and then I won't know that I've said it. I'm just that way. That's the way I am. But you know, I really am the stereotypical absent-minded professor at times. I really, really am.
Gee, I have trouble believing that.
Yeah, well, ha ha ha. Regardless, but you're right. Some people refer to writing, for example, as what was it? Profitable mental illness. There's it's a compulsion.
Yeah.
Like for writers, it really is a compulsion.
Yeah.
And I think that if you are a writer, you really have no choice. You'll write. It's just something that you'll just instinctively do it.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not a writer and you heard everything we said and you're like, wow, that sounds really hard, then don't do it. Really. If you don't think you can do it and don't want to do it, go find an easier hobby. Like, seriously. Or go take up drawing. I hear that's much easier.
Yeah, it's a lot easier.
Exactly. Or the piano, or take up sports. Go out and do something else. But seriously, this episode is semi-seriously called, why you shouldn't be a writer. And the truth is, if you are not really drawn to it, if this is not something you're really calling or you're not serious about it or willing to be serious about it, don't do it, man. Really, don't do it. I'm 100% serious when I say that. If you do feel a calling for it and you do feel this is something that you should do in your life, then do it. Absolutely do it. Just say, nope, screw you, Rob. I'm going to go do it. And that's fine. That's good too.
Yeah.
But be prepared that everything we've said is true, and there's even a lot of bad stuff that we haven't talked about in this episode. Like things that writing can actually do to your health, for example. And let's just say writers don't have the most stable marriages in the world. And there are many, many costs that come with being a writer. There are many benefits that come with being a writer too, but there are many costs.
Yeah.
And you have to be willing to pay them to be a writer. It's not that easy. Mind you, again, if you feel you're called to it and have no choice, well, then you have no choice and you'll just deal with it as you go.
Or you can always take if you're going to do any kind of creative endeavor, like we were saying, if you do it without any expectation of like remittance at any point, no, that's fine too. You can always just fart around with doing stuff. Yeah,
that's true. That's true. If I'm talking about, of course, about being a serious professional writer as opposed to a hobbyist. But if you just want to, muck around, if you want to be a mucker and just play with writing and that, and just write little short stories that you post on Wattpad or something like that, go ahead. Like if it's just something you do for a little bit for fun and you don't have any great aspirations for it, go ahead. There's nothing wrong with that. That's fine.
Although there's a risk there too, because you never know if you're going to get hooked.
There is that. Yes, that's true. Or, again, opportunity costs, like back to the whole economics thing.
Yeah.
You might be spending time doing something that you shouldn't be doing. You could get better results by doing something else. I do believe that people should generally try almost every hobby once,
Yeah.
just to see if they actually have a talent for it or see if they like it,
Mm-hmm.
and even at different stages in your life. I mean, my father's a good example. I mean, for most of his life, he played the piano a bit, but that he wasn't into music that much overall, I guess. He basically played the piano for his whole life. Let's go with that way. And then one day he picked up a guitar and discovered that it was the most wonderful thing in the world, and he loved playing guitar.
Mm-hmm.
That's a completely true story. My father has like a dozen guitars now and like loves to play guitar.
Wow.
How good he is at it? Well, he's better at playing the guitar than he was at the piano. Let's put it that way.
Huh.
But that was just something that at a certain phase in his life, he tried it and he fell in love with it.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, you should try different hobbies, and I guess you should try them at different times in your life, because sometimes they click and sometimes they don't.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually not a bad spot to end this. I think that there's nothing wrong with being a mucker, but just be aware that if you try to go pro, it's a hard road.
Yeah.
It really is, and you have to be aware that there are costs and there are consequences to it.
Mm-hmm.
But again, if you feel called to it, why not? Or if you want to have fun, why not?
Yeah, you never know. You might be the next great dinosaur pornography creator.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Actually, right now it's insect porn. I think is probably selling much better than dinosaur porn. But whatever.
Wow. Okay. I'm never going on the internet again.
Rule 34, man. Rule 34. That's the way it is.
Yikes.
Good night, folks. Talk to you later. Thanks for listening to the show. If you'd like to hear more or join the conversation, come visit us at obeythedna.com. You can also find us on iTunes or whatever fine podcast site forgot to lock their back door. So until next time, remember that to master the nerdly arts takes time, practice, and enough Coca-Cola to drop a rhino. See ya! Come on over and join the conversation at obeythedna.com, where you will find show notes and more.